if you look at the long, data going back decades, there's been a lot of hailstorms in this part of the country. That is called Hail Alley, for a good reason.
He's talking about Hail Alley or Hailstorm Alley. It's an area that stretches from High River just south of Calgary north to central Alberta. And the region is notorious with a reputation for being hit dozens of times every year by hailstorms. According to the latest from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, between 2019 and 2023, insured losses from hail damage in Alberta totaled nearly $3 billion, with one storm topping the charts, the one that hit Calgary back in 2020. 70,000 insurance claims netted $1.3 billion in damage. Hail Alley is one thing, but Calgarians are noticing a lot of storms in recent memory are hitting the northmost communities in Calgary. And that's something researchers are noticing too.
Truth be told, it's pretty random. It's extremely unfortunate that we have two storms that have hit a similar part of the city in such a short time. But the storms will come in typically from the west or the northwest, and near Cochrane is a hotspot for severe storm formation. So the northern parts, if I were to guess, make an educated guess, I think they're probably more at risk than areas farther to the south in the city. And it's a lot to do with the topography in the mountains and just where the storms tend to develop. So the topography is important because it allows moisture from the croplands to pool in the foothills. Moisture is fuel for storms. They're just giant vacuum cleaners. So the more moist and warm your area is, the more energy it has to fuel those really strong updrafts and make a really potent storm. So you need those foothills. And we have the Bow Valley that's west of the city. So there's a bit of a break in the mountain barrier, but to the north and south of that, like Water Valley and those areas, we find there's a lot of storms developing there, and that's because we do have that terrain and the pooling of the moisture along the foothills of the mountains.
And so it's like the storm kind of forms and then it just happens to release more north than south, or how does that part work?
Right, so we're living in a part of the world where the upper atmospheric winds tend to be out of the west, and oftentimes with storms like this, the winds will be coming out southwest or westerly. And these storms are so strong, they create their own environment. So they don't care if the winds are westerly. They'll start moving to the southeast. They'll deviate, we call it, from the prevailing winds. That's what happened on the weekend. The storms were tracking with the steering winds, so they came into Calgary. This particular storm, the hail swath was over 10 kilometers wide, and it tracked for 120 kilometers. That second half was east of the city, so we were on it for the first 60 kilometers. But within that 12-kilometer band, we do find the storm cycles, so it's not consistently as severe. Depending on the air it's ingesting, it can ramp up or ramp down a bit. So that's why we see these non-uniform distribution of hail in the swath.
So it almost in like a neighborhood level, you can be a neighborhood over from where a massive devastation happens.
Yes. It's unfortunately it can be that, like a knife's edge. We have a hail pad network out, and we're spacing them 3 kilometers apart, and even that's too far really to capture the signal, the full distribution of hail. You need sensors 100, 500 meters apart to really capture that noise in the hail swath.
And the reason we don't have that kind of technology, is it just the plain expense of it?
It's too expensive. I mean, we do have 20 hail stations across Calgary right now, and they're typically about 4 kilometers apart. So we had 10 of those stations were hit by hail, and they measured up to 40 millimeters during the storm. But even then, we weren't able to capture everything, not as much as we'd like to. There are still some gaps in the city that we'd like to fill.
What's the purpose of filling those gaps? Does it just give people peace of mind, or is it actually helpful for like scientific reasons?
It's helpful scientifically. If we have these stations around the city and we know one area has been affected, then areas downwind of that, they can maybe get a bit of a heads up of exactly what's heading their way, just how bad it is.
Are you understanding more about that as you kind of are getting to this storm?
We've been studying hail for a long time in Alberta, back to the late 50s and even the 60s, but then there was a hiatus for about 40 years where very little research was done. Recently, there's been a resurgence in hail research, and we now have tools and equipment that they couldn't even have imagined, like UAVs, electronic distrometers, 3D scanners, And so we're basically bringing a lot of that research into the 21st century. We're finding that hail is very nuanced and very difficult and challenging, and we're still learning things now from each storm, really, because each storm is different. You know, nature doesn't really repeat itself. Every storm's unique in some way, and that's the challenge. That's what makes it really difficult.
In terms of people who live in the parts of Alberta that maybe see these more often, like, what can you tell them about that?
Never underestimate the power of nature and its ability to cause harm in these situations. In the long term, it's best to try and build a resilient homestead where especially the cladding is resistant to hail damage, or as resistant as you can make it.
And in some of these newer communities, I mean, what can you say about just the developments of today and maybe if they are built to suit this kind of weather or not?
To be honest and candid, they're not. You know, with houses, we tend to think there's a one-size-fits-all, and if I could, you know, wave a magic wand, certain communities that are prone to hail, there would be different building codes in place to, you know, make sure that you do have siding that's hail resilient and shingles that are resilient to hail. Unfortunately, vinyl siding and shingles are probably the worst thing you can have in your house in an event of a severe storm like this.